The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, continued. Cassette 5, Side 1. How clean were the bodies behind the frills? A 16th century Introduction pour les jeunes dames spoke of women who have no care to keep themselves clean except in those parts that may be seen, remaining filthy under their linen. And a cynical proverb held that courtesans were the only women who washed more than their face and hands. Perhaps cleanliness increased with immorality, for as women offered more of themselves to view or to many, cleanliness enlarged its area. Frequent bathing, preferably in perfumed water, became now, especially in France, part of good manners. Public bathhouses diminished in number as private bathrooms multiplied. These, however, were usually without running water, depending on bowls and tubs. Steam baths, which had come into Western Europe with returning crusaders in the 13th century, continued popular through the 16th. The home almost replaced the church as the center of religious worship in Protestant lands. The father served as priest, leading the family in daily prayers, Bible reading, and psalms, and the mother taught her children the catechism. In the middle classes, comfort went with piety. This was the age when the table evolved by joining trestles and boards into a sturdy-legged unity, benches and cushions evolved into the upholstered chair, and the four-poster bed, carved and canopied, became a symbol of moral stability and financial success. Furniture, plate, andirons, and kitchen utensils were made to endure, even sparkle, for generations. Pewter replaced wooden platters. Spoons of tin or silver replaced those of wood. Houses were big because families were large. Women bore almost annually, often in vain, for infantile mortality was high. John Colet was the eldest of 22 children. By the time he was 32, all the others were dead. Anton Koberger, the Nuremberg painter, had 25 children and survived 12 of them. Dürer was one of 18 children, of whom only 3 seemed to have reached maturity. To round out the family, there were household pets almost as numerous as the progeny. Parrots had come in from the West Indies, and monkeys from India were domestic favorites. A whole literature instructed women and children in the care of dogs and birds. Meals were enormous. Vegetables were despised and only slowly won acceptance. The cabbage, carrot, lettuce, rhubarb, potato, lima bean, and strawberry now came into common use. The main meal or dinner was taken at 11 in the morning. Supper was deferred till 7. The higher the class, the later the hour. Beer and wine were the staple drinks at all meals, even breakfast. One of Thomas More's claims to fame was that he drank water. About 1550, the Spaniards brought in chocolate from Mexico. Coffee had not yet percolated from Arabia into Western Europe. In 1512, the household of the Duke of Northumberland allowed a quart of ale per person per meal, even to boys 8 years old. The average consumption of ale in 16th century Coventry was a quart per day for every man, woman, and child. The breweries of Munich were renowned as early as the 14th century. Drunkenness was in good repute in England till Bloody Mary frowned upon it. It remained popular in Germany. The French drank more stably, not being quite so cold. Despite poverty and oppression, many of the graces of life continued. Even the poor had gardens. The tulip, first brought to Western Europe about 1550 by Busbecq, imperial ambassador at Constantinople, became a national passion in Holland. Country houses were a pleasant fashion in England and France. Villagers still had their seasonal festivals, May Day, Harvest Home, All Saints, Christmas, and many more. Kings themselves went maying and crowned themselves with flowers. The amusements of the rich sometimes provided exciting pageantry for the poor, as when Henry II entered Lyon in state in 1548. And commoners might, at a respectful distance, watch lords joust at tournaments, till that sport went out of style after the death of Diane's king. Religious processions became more pagan as the age of Henry VIII moved toward the Elizabethan, and on the continent, an easy morality allowed nude women, in festival pageants, to impersonate historical or mythological characters. Dürer confessed himself fascinated by such a display at Antwerp in 1521. And there were games. Rabelais filled a chapter by merely listing them, real and imagined, and Bruegel showed almost 100 of them in one painting. Bear-baiting, bullfighting, cockfighting amused the populace. Football, bowling, boxing, wrestling exercised and exorcised young commoners. and Paris alone had 250 tennis courts for its blue bloods in the 16th century. All classes hunted and gambled. Some ladies threw dice, some bishops played cards for money. Mummers, acrobats, and players roamed the countryside and performed for lords and royalty. Within doors, people played cards, chess, backgammon, and a score of other games. Of all pastimes, the best beloved was the dance. After dinner, says Rabelais, they all went tag-rag together to the willowy grove, where on the green grass, to the sound of merry flutes and pleasant bagpipes, they danced so gallantly that it was a sweet and heavenly sport to see. So in England, on May Day, villagers gathered round a gaily decorated maypole, danced their lusty rustic measures, and then it appears indulged in intimacies reminiscent of the Roman festival of Flora, goddess of flowers. Under Henry VIII, the May Games usually included the Morris, that is, Moorish, dance, which had come from the Spanish Moors via the Spanish fandango with castanets. Students danced so boisterously at Oxford and Cambridge that William of Wykeham had to forbid the ecstasy near chapel statuary. Luther approved of dancing and relished especially the square dance with friendly bows, embracings, and hearty swinging of the partners. The grave Melanchthon danced, and at Leipzig in the 16th century the city fathers regularly held a ball to permit students to become acquainted with the most honorable and elegant daughters of magnates, senators, and citizens. Charles VI often led ballet, the ballet or dance at the French court. Catherine de Médicis brought Italian dancers to France, and there, in the later days of that unhappy Queen Mother, dancing developed new aristocratic forms. Dancing, said Jean Tabourot, in one of the oldest books on one of the oldest arts, is practiced in order to see whether lovers are healthy and suitable for one another. At the end of a dance, the gentleman is permitted to kiss his mistress, in order that he may ascertain if she has agreeable breath. In this manner, dancing becomes necessary for the good government of society. It was through its accompaniment of the dance that music developed from its vocal and choral forms into the instrumental compositions that have made it the dominating art of our time. Chapter 34. Music, 1300 to 1564. 1. The instruments. The popularity of music in these centuries corrects the somber note that history tends to give them. Every now and then, through the excitement and bitterness of the religious revolution, we hear people singing. "I care nothing for the pleasures of food, gaming, and love," wrote the passionate printer Etienne Dolet. "Music alone takes me prisoner, holds me fast, dissolves me in ecstasy." From the pure note of a girl's voice or a perfect flute to the polyphonic counterpoint of Desprez or Palestrina, every nation and class redeemed with music the commercialism and theology of the age. Not only did everyone sing, Francesco Landino complained that everyone composed. Between the merry or plaintive folk songs of the village and the solemn high masses of the church, 100 forms of music lent their harmony to dances, ballets, banquets, courtships, courts, processions, pageants, plays, and prayers. The world sang. The merchants of Antwerp were escorted daily to the Bourse by a band. Kings studied music as no feminine or mechanical prerogative, but as a mark and fount of civilization. Alfonso X of Spain sedulously and lovingly collected songs to the Virgin. Cantigas de Santa Maria. James IV of Scotland wooed Margaret Tudor with clavichord and lute. Charles VIII of France took the royal choir with him on his campaigns in Italy. Louis XII sang tenor in the court choir. Leo X composed French chansons. Henry VIII and Francis I courted and challenged each other with rival choirs on the field of the cloth of gold. Luis Milan described Portugal in 1540 as a veritable sea of music. The court of Matthias Corvinus at Buda had a choir rated equal to the Pope's, and there was a good school of music under Sigismund II in Krakow. Germany was bursting with song in Luther's youth. "We have singers here in Heidelberg," wrote Alexander Agricola in 1484, "whose leader composes for 8 or 12 voices." At Mainz, Nuremberg, Augsburg, and elsewhere, the Meistersinger continued to adorn popular songs and biblical passages with the pomp of pedantry and the jewelry of counterpoint. The German folk songs were probably the best in Europe. Everywhere music was the prod of piety and the lure of love. Although nearly all music in this age was vocal, the accompanying instruments were as diverse as a modern orchestra. There were string instruments like psalteries, harps, dulcimers, shawms, lutes, and viols, wind instruments like flutes, oboes, bassoons, trumpets, trombones, cornets, and bagpipes, percussion instruments like drums, bells, clappers, cymbals, and castanets, keyboard instruments like organs, clavichords, harpsichords, spinets, virginals. There were many more, and of many there were fascinating variants in place and time. Every educated home had one or more musical instruments, and some homes had special cabinets to hold them. Often they were works of art, fondly carved or fancifully formed, and they were handed down as treasures and memories from generation to generation. Some organs were as elaborately designed as Gothic cathedral fronts, so the men who built the organs for the Sebaldeskirche and the Lorenzkirche in Nuremberg became immortal for a century. The organ was the chief but not the only instrument used in churches. Flutes, pipes, drums, trombones, even kettle drums might add their incongruous summons to adoration. The favorite accompaniment for the single voice was the lute. Like all string instruments, it had an Asiatic origin. It came into Spain with the Moors, and there, as the vihuela, it rose to the dignity of a solo instrument, for which the earliest known purely instrumental music was composed. Usually its body was made of wood and ivory, and shaped like a pear. Its belly was pierced with holes in the pattern of a rose. It had 6, sometimes 12 pairs of strings, which were plucked by the fingers. Its neck was divided by frets of brass into a measured scale, and its peg box was turned back from the neck. When a pretty girl held a lute in her lap, strummed its strings, and added her voice to its tones, Cupid could save an arrow. However, it was difficult to keep the lute in tune, for the constant pull of the strings tended to warp the frame, and one wit said of an old lutenist that 60 of his 80 years had been spent in tuning his instrument. The viol differed from the lute in having its strings stretched over a bridge and played by a bow, but the principle was the same. The vibration of taut struck strings over a box perforated to deepen sound. Viols came in 3 sizes. The large bass viola da gamba, held between the legs, like its modern replacement, the violoncello, the small tenor viola da braccio, held on the arm, and the treble viol. During the 16th century, the viola da braccio evolved into the violin, and in the 18th, the viol passed out of use. The only European invention in musical instruments was the keyboard, by which the strings were indirectly struck instead of being directly plucked or bowed. The oldest known form, the clavichord, made its debut in the 12th century and survived to be well-tempered by Johann Sebastian Bach. The oldest extant example, from 1537, is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. In the 15th century, a sturdier variant took form in the harpsichord. This allowed modifications of tone through differences of pressure. Sometimes a second keyboard extended the gamut, and stops and couplers offered new marvels of sound. The spinet and virginal were Italian and English variants of the harpsichord. These keyboard instruments, like the viol and the lute, were prized for their beauty as well as their tone, and formed a graceful element of decoration in well-to-do homes. As instruments improved in range and quality of tone and in complexity of operation, more and more training and skill were required to play them successfully. An audience grew for performances of one or more instruments without voices, and virtuosos appeared for the organ and the lute. Konrad Paumann, who died in 1473, the blind organist of Nuremberg, traveled from court to court giving recitals whose excellence knighted him. Such developments encouraged the composition of music for instruments alone. Till the 15th century, nearly all instrumental music had apparently been intended to accompany voices or dances, but in that century several paintings show musicians playing with no visible singing or dancing. The oldest surviving music for instruments alone is the Fundamentum Organisandi, from 1452, of Konrad Paumann, which was composed primarily as a guide to organ playing, but contained also a number of pieces for solo performance. Ottaviano de Petrucci's application of movable metal types to the printing of music in 1501 lowered the cost of publishing instrumental and other compositions. Music written for dances lent itself to independent presentation, hence the influence of dance forms on instrumental music. The suite of movements composed for a succession of dances led to the symphony and the chamber music quartet, whose parts sometimes retained dance names. The lute, viol, organ, and harpsichord were favored for solo or orchestral performances. Alberto d'Aripa, achieved such fame as a lutenist at the court of Francis I and Henry II that when he died in 1551, the poets of France warbled dirges to his remains. 2. The Flemish Ascendancy, 1430 to 1590. The songs and dances of the people were the perennial fountain from which non-ecclesiastical forms of music took their origin, moods, and themes. And even masses might stem from such ditties as Adieu mes amours. The chanson of France ranged from the lilting lays of street singers and the ballads of troubadours to the intricate polyphonic chants of Guillaume de Machaut and Josquin des Prés. Machaut, circa 1300 to 1377, was the lord of that Ars Nova which Philippe de Vitry had expounded in 1325. Music using binary rhythms in addition to the triple rhythms sanctioned by the Ars Antiqua and the Church. Machaut was a poet, a scholar, a musician, a canon of Reims Cathedral, probably also a man of ardor, for he wrote some amorous lyrics whose warmth has not yet cooled. He excelled in a dozen musical forms, ballads, rondels, virelays, motets, masses. To him we trace the oldest polyphonic mass composed by one man. Though an ecclesiastic, he shared in the movement to secularize polyphonic music, to lead it from the orthodox rhythms of the motet and the high mass to the freer, more flexible cantilena of secular song. In those centuries, the English were musical. They did not rival the Italians in melody, who has, nor the Flemings in polyphony, but their songs now and then touched a strain of tenderness and delicacy equaled only in the profoundest French chanson. English singers were acclaimed at the Council of Constance, and in that generation Henry V, hero of Agincourt, composed a mass whose Gloria and Sanctus are still preserved. The compositions of John Dunstable, circa 1370 to 1453, were sung from Scotland to Rome and played a part in forming the style of the Flemish school. As Flanders had set the pace in painting in the 15th century, so it was there, in a milieu of prosperous and art-loving nobles and burghers, that music had one of its most exuberant periods. Today, wrote Johannes Ververa, about 1490, we have blossoming forth, quite apart from a large number of famous singers, an almost unlimited number of composers, whose works excel in pleasant sound. I never hear or look at their compositions without rejoicing in them. Contemporaries would probably have ranked Dufay, Ockeghem, and Desprez quite on a par with Jan van Eyck, Klaus Sluter, and Rogier van der Weyden in the hierarchy of genius and beneficence. Here, in Flemish polyphony, Western Europe lived the last phase of the Gothic spirit in art. Religious devotion tempered with secular gaiety, forms firm in base and structure, fragile and delicate in development and ornament. Even Italy, so hostile to Gothic, joined Western Europe in acknowledging the supremacy of Flemish music, and in seeking maestri from Flanders for episcopal choirs and princely courts. Emperor Maximilian I, enchanted by the music of Brussels, formed a choir in Vienna on Flemish models. Charles V took Flemish musicians to Spain. Archduke Ferdinand took some to Austria, Christian II others to Denmark. The fountain of music, said the Venetian Cavallo, is in the Netherlands. Through this Flemish ascendancy, professional music escaped the narrowing nationalism of the age. Guillaume Dufay led the way. Born in Hainaut, circa 1399, trained as a boy chorister in the Cathedral of Cambrai, he was called to Rome to sing in the Sistine Chapel. Then, back in Cambrai, he raised its choir to international renown. The masses that he composed there were sung in all the musical centers of Latin Christendom. Those that survive sound heavy and slow, to ears alert to the light celerity of modern life, yet they may have fitted well in stately cathedrals or solemn papal choirs. More to our mood is a polyphonic song of mellifluous melancholy, Le jour s'endort, the day is going to sleep. We picture a robed chorus singing such a chant in the Gothic halls of Cambrai, Ypres, Brussels, Bruges, Ghent, or Dijon, and we perceive that the architecture, painting, costumes, music, and manners of that warm and colorful and pompous age made a harmonious artistic whole, being themselves variations on one pervasive theme. Dufay's methods were developed and were broadcast through Europe by the most influential musical teacher of perhaps any time. Johannes Ockeghem, born in Flanders circa 1430, spent most of his years providing music and musical education at the court of France. His special passion was for the canon, a form of fugue in which the words and melody sung by the first voice were repeated, several bars later, by a second voice, later by a third, and so on, in a flowing counterpoint whose laborious complexity challenged the singers and charmed the composers. These ran to him from every Roman Catholic land to learn and carry off his skill. Through his pupils, wrote an old historian, the art of contrapuntal and canonical polyphony was transplanted into all countries, and he must be regarded, for it can be proved by stylistic genealogy, as the founder of all schools from his own to the present age. But since this was written in 1833, Ockeghem cannot be held responsible for 20th century music. At his death in 1495, the musicians of Europe wrote motets to his memory, and Erasmus a lamentation. The names of even the immortals are writ in water. His pupils became the musical leaders of the next generation. Coming from Hainaut to Paris, Josquin des Prés spent years studying with Ockeghem, then served as Maestro di Cappella, master of the chapel choir, in Florence, Milan, and Ferrara. For Duke Ercole I, he wrote a miserere that soon resounded throughout Western Europe. After 6 years in the Sistine Chapel choir, he returned to Paris in 1494 to serve as maître de chapelle for Louis XII. One of his noblest works was his Déploration de Jean Ockeghem, a dirge for his dead teacher. For a time he followed him in composing masses and motets in canonic style, piling voice upon voice in almost mathematical problems of sequence and harmony. When his skill was complete and his supremacy in art music was unquestioned, he tired of technique and wrote motets, hymns, and secular songs in a simpler harmonic style, in which the music followed and illuminated the words instead of torturing them on a Protean canon or stretching a syllable into a song. When both teacher and pupil were gone, it became customary to call Ockeghem the Donatello, des Prés the Michelangelo of musical art. The French court cultivated music as the finest flower of wealth and power. A lovely tapestry, dated about 1500, and now in the Musée des Gobelins at Paris, pictures 4 women, 3 youths, and a bald monk grouped in a garden around a fountain. One lad is playing a lute, a girl plays a viol, a staid lady plays a portable organ. French poets intended their lyrics to be sung. An Académie du Palais devoted itself to promoting the union between music and poetry. And even now, one without the other seems incomplete. Clément Jonquin, a pupil of des Prés, excelled in descriptive chanson. His Chant de l'Alouette, or Song of the Lark, from 1521, still warbles over several continents. Spanish music reflected the piety and gallantry of the people. Cross-fertilized by Arabic, Italian, Provençal, French, and Flemish influences, this art ranged from melancholy Morisco monodies to stately polyphonic masses in the Flemish style. One of the greatest composers of the 16th century, Cristobal Morales, carried polyphony to high excellence and transmitted his art to his more famous pupil, Tomas Luis de Victoria. By contrast, the Arabic heritage produced just the strains to fit the lute. Luis de Milan and Miguel de Fuenlana composed for the vihuela and performed on it songs that rivaled the German leader in range and power. The conquest of Italy by Flemish musicians continued to the rise of Palestrina. Heinrich Isaac, after absorbing the contrapuntal art in Flanders, was brought to Florence by Lorenzo de' Medici to teach Il Magnifico's children. He stayed there 14 years and composed music for Lorenzo's songs. Disturbed by the French invasion of Italy, he passed into the service of Maximilian I at Innsbruck, where he shared in giving form to the leader. In 1502 he returned to Italy, pensioned by the emperor and his former pupil Leo X. His masses, motets, and songs, above all his Choralis Constantinus, 58 4-part settings for the offices of the Mass throughout the religious year, were ranked with the highest music of the age. Orlando di Lasso brought the Flemish school to its culmination and illustrated, in his triumphant career, the geographical range and rising social status of Renaissance musicians. As a boy chorister in his native Hainaut, he so fascinated his hearers that he was twice abducted by those who hoped to profit from his voice. Finally, in his 15th year, possibly around 1545, his parents allowed Ferdinand Gonzaga to take him to Italy. At the age of 23, he became choir master in the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. In 1555 he settled in Antwerp and published his first book of Italian madrigals, secular lyrics dressed in all the frills of Flemish counterpoint. In the same year he issued a miscellany of villanelles, songs of Neapolitan origin, French chansons, and 4 religious motets. This collection well reflected the judicious oscillation of de Lasso's life between profane enjoyment and melodious penitence. We get a glimpse of his environment at Antwerp in the dedication of a motet to Cardinal Pole and another to Cardinal Granville, minister to Philip II in the Netherlands. Probably it was Granville who arranged the young composer's engagement to assist in directing the ducal choir at Munich in 1556. Orlando came to like Bavaria as much as Italy, took his wife from one as he had taken his name from the other, and served the Bavarian dukes till his death. This happy Mozart of the 16th century doubled the 626 compositions of his counterpart. He traversed the whole gamut of current musical forms, and in each won European renown. He seemed equally at home in madrigals of refined love, chansons of amorous levity, and masses of mystic piety. In 1563 he was made Kapellmeister. Now he composed for Albert V the musical setting of the 7 penitential psalms. The Duke so admired these compositions that he engaged artists to transcribe them on parchment, adorn them with miniatures, and bind them in red morocco in 2 folio volumes, which are today among the most prized possessions of the State Library in art-loving Munich. All Europe solicited the new star. When de Lasso visited Paris in 1571, Charles IX offered him 1,200 livres, or about $30,000 per year, to stay. He refused, but presented Charles and Catherine de Médicis with a book of French chansons, the most melodious, said Brantôme, that Paris had ever heard. One song chanted the praises of the French capital for its love of justice and peace, a year before the massacre of St. Bartholomew. Returning to Munich, de Lasso dedicated to the Fuggers a collection of Latin motets, Italian madrigals, German lieder, and French chansons. This composer was no romantic starveling, but a man adept in the ways of the world. In 1574 he traveled to Rome at Duke Albert's expense, gave Gregory XIII a volume of masses, and received the Order of the Golden Spur. Even God appreciated Orlando's dedications, for when on Corpus Christi Day in 1584 a severe storm threatened to cancel the usual religious procession through the streets of Munich, the rain stopped and the sun came out as Orlando's motet, Gustate et Videte, Taste and See How Gracious the Lord Is, was sung by his choir, and every year thereafter on Corpus Christi the same music was sung to ensure propitious skies. In 1585 de Lasso, aging and repentant, published his 5th book of madrigals, in which he applied the form to spiritual themes. These are among his most moving compositions. 5 years later his mind began to fail. He could no longer recognize his wife, and talked of almost nothing but death, the Last Judgment, and an increase in salary. He received the increase, and died triumphant and insane in 1594. 3. Music and the Reformation. The Reformation was a revolution in music as well as in theology, ritual, ethics, and art. Catholic liturgy was aristocratic, a stately ceremonial rooted in inviolable tradition and standing frankly above the people in language, vestments, symbols, and music. In that spirit, the clergy defined itself as the Church and thought of the people as a flock to be shepherded into morality and salvation by myth, legend, sermon, drama, and all the arts. In that spirit, the Mass was an esoteric mystery, a miraculous intercourse of the priest with God, and the music of the Mass was sung by the priest and a male choir set apart from the worshippers. But in the Reformation, the middle classes asserted themselves. The people became the Church, the clergy became their ministers, the language of the service was to be the vernacular of the nation, the music was to be intelligible, and in it the congregation would take an active, finally a leading, role. Luther loved music, appreciated polyphony and counterpoint, and wrote enthusiastically in 1538, "When natural music is sharpened and polished by art, then one begins to see with amazement the great and perfect wisdom of God in his wonderful work of music, where one voice takes a simple part, and around it sing 3, 4, or 5 other voices, leaping, springing round about, marvelously gracing the simple part, like a square dance in heaven. He who does not find this an inexpressible miracle of the Lord is truly a clod, and is not worthy to be considered a man." At the same time, he aspired to a religious music that would move the people by its fusion of faith with song. In 1524 he collaborated with Johann Walter, Kapellmeister to the Elector Frederick the Wise, to produce the first Protestant hymnal, which was expanded and improved through many editions. The words were taken partly from Catholic hymns, partly from the songs of the Meistersinger, partly from Luther's own roughly poetic pen, partly from folk songs transformed to religious themes. "The devil," said Luther, "has no right to all the good tunes." Some of the music was composed by Luther, some by Walter, some was adapted from current Catholic settings. Lutheran churches continued for almost a century to include polyphonic masses in their ritual. But gradually Latin was replaced by the vernacular, the role of the Mass was reduced, singing by the congregation was extended, and the chants of the choir moved away from counterpoint to an easier harmonic form in which the music sought to follow and interpret the words. From the choir music composed by Luther and his aides to accompany the recitation of gospel narratives came the noble Protestant church music of the 18th century, culminating in the oratorios of Handel and the masses, oratorios, and chorales of Johann Sebastian Bach. Not all the founders of Protestantism were so favorable to music as Luther. Zwingli, though himself a musician, excluded music altogether from the religious service, and Calvin forbade any church music except unisonal singing by the congregation. But he allowed polyphonic song in the home, and his Huguenot followers in France took part of their strength and courage from family singing of hymns and psalms set to music for several voices. When Clément Marot translated the Psalms into French verse, Calvin so liked the result that he condoned the polyphonic settings arranged by Claude Goudimel, and the fact that this Protestant composer was slain in the massacre of St. Bartholomew made his Psalter a doubly holy book. A century after Marot, a Catholic bishop expressed his envy of the role these translations and settings had played in the French Reformation. To know these psalms by heart is, among the Huguenots, a sign of the communion to which they belong. And in the towns in which they are most numerous, the airs may be heard coming from the mouths of artisans, and in the country from those of tillers of the soil. The democratization of religious music marked the lands of the Reformation, covering the darkness of the creed with the releasing joy of song. 4. Palestrina, 1526 to 1594. The Catholic Church remained the chief patron of music, as of the other arts. North of the Alps, Catholic music proceeded along the lines set by the Flemish school. This tradition was confirmed by Isaac in Austria and by De Lasso in Bavaria. One of Luther's most generous letters was addressed in 1530 to Ludwig Senfl, complimenting him on the music he was composing at Munich and praising the Catholic dukes there because they cultivate and honor music. The choir of the Sistine Chapel was still the model on which kings and princes established their chapels in the 14th and 15th centuries. Even among Protestants, the highest form of musical composition was the Mass, and the crowning glory of a Mass was to be sung by the papal choir. The supreme ambition of a singer was to join that choir, which was therefore able to include the best male voices in Western Europe. Castrati, then called eunuchi, were first admitted to the Sistine choir about 1550. Soon afterward, some appeared at the Bavarian court. The emasculation was performed on consenting boys who were persuaded that their soprano voices would be a greater asset to them than fertility, a vulgar virtue generally supplied beyond demand. Like any old and complex institution which has so much to lose by an unsuccessful innovation, the Church was conservative, even more in ritual than in creed. Composers, on the contrary, were weary of old modes, as they have been in all ages, and experiment was to them the life of their art. All through these centuries, the Church struggled to prevent the artificiality of the Ars Nova and the subtlety of Flemish counterpoint from weakening the dignity and grandeur of the High Mass. In 1322, Pope John XXII issued a stern decree against musical novelties and decoration, and ordered that the music of the Mass should keep to unisonal plain song, the Gregorian chant as its foundation, and permit only such harmony as would be intelligible to worshippers, and would deepen rather than distract piety. The order was obeyed for a century. Then it was evaded by having some of the performers sing the bass part an octave higher than written. This faux bourdon, false bass, became a favorite ruse in France. Complexities in mass music developed again. 5, 6, or 8 parts were sung in fugue and counterpoint, in which the words of the liturgy ran upon one another's heels in professional confusion, or were drowned in musical flourishes, sometimes inserted by the singers ad libitum. The custom of adapting popular tunes into a mass led even to the intrusion of profane words into the sacred text. Some masses came to be known from their secular sources, like the Mass of Farewell My Loves, or the Mass in the Shadow of the Bush. The liberal Erasmus was himself so disgusted with the artificiality of art masses that he protested in a note to his edition of the New Testament. Modern church music is so constructed that the congregation cannot hear one distinct word. The choristers themselves do not understand what they are singing. There was no church music in St. Paul's time. Words were then pronounced plainly. Words nowadays mean nothing. Men leave their work and go to church to listen to more noises than were ever heard in Greek or Roman theaters. Money must be made to buy organs and train boys to squeal. In this matter, the Reform party within the church agreed with Erasmus. Bishop Ghiberti of Verona forbade the use of amorous songs or popular melodies in the churches of his diocese, and Bishop Moroni of Modena prohibited all figured music, that is, music adorned with the elaboration of motives or themes. At the Council of Trent, the Catholic reformers urged the exclusion of all polyphonic music from church services and a return to monodic Gregorian chant. The predilection of Pope Pius IV for Palestrina's masses may have helped to save the day for Catholic polyphony. Giovanni Luigi Palestrina took his name from a little city in the Roman Campagna, which in ancient days had entered history as Praeneste. In 1537 we find him listed at the age of 11 among the choir boys at Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. He was not yet 21 when he was appointed choir master in the cathedral of his native town. So established, he married in 1547 Lucrezia di Goris, a woman of helpful but moderate means. When the Bishop of Palestrina became Julius III, he brought his choirmaster to Rome and made him head of the Capella Julia in St. Peter's, which trained singers for the Sistine Chapel. To the new pope, the young composer dedicated his first book of masses in 1554, one of which presented a three-voice counterpoint accompaniment to one voice in plain song. The pope liked these masses enough to give Palestrina membership in the Sistine Choir. As a married man, Giovanni's position in this usually tonsured group seemed irregular and evoked some opposition. Palestrina was about to dedicate a book of madrigals to the Pope when Julius died in 1555. Marcellus II lived only 3 weeks after his elevation to the papacy. To his memory, the composer dedicated in 1555 his famous Missa Papae Marcelli, which was not published or so named till 1567. Pope Paul IV, the man of inflexible and Puritan principles, dismissed the 3 married members from the Sistine Choir, allotting each a small pension. Palestrina was soon made choirmaster at St. John Lateran, but this position, though it buttered his bread, offered no patronage to cover the expense of publishing musical compositions. With the accession of Pius IV in 1559, papal favor returned. Pius was impressed by the improperia that Palestrina wrote for the Good Friday service, and from that time his composition became a regular part of that ritual in the Sistine Chapel. Palestrina's marriage still excluded him from the Sistine Choir, but his status rose with his appointment in 1561 as choirmaster at Santa Maria Maggiore. A year later, the reassembled Council of Trent took up the problem of adjusting church music to the new spirit of reform. The extreme proposal to forbid polyphony altogether was rejected. A compromise measure was passed urging ecclesiastical authorities to exclude from churches all such music as introduces anything of the impure or lascivious, in order that the house of God may truly be seen to be the house of prayer. Pius IV appointed a committee of 8 cardinals to implement this decree in the Diocese of Rome. A pleasant story relates that the commission was on the verge of banning polyphonic music when one member, Cardinal Charles Borromeo, appealed to Palestrina to compose a mass that would show the full congruity of polyphony and piety. That Palestrina wrote, and a choir sang for the commission 3 masses, one of them the Missa Papae Marcelli, and that the profound union of religious elevation and chastened musical artistry in these masses saved polyphony from condemnation. However, the Mass of Pope Marcellus was already 10 years old, and the only known connection of Palestrina with this commission is its extension of his pension. We may nonetheless believe that the music which Palestrina had presented in the choirs of Rome, by its fidelity to the words, its avoidance of secular motives, and the subordination of musical art to religious intent, played a part in leading the committee to sanction polyphonic music. It was an added argument for polyphony that Palestrina's ecclesiastical compositions normally dispensed with instrumental adornment and were almost always written a cappella, in chapel style, that is, for voices alone. In 1571, Palestrina was again made choirmaster of the Capella Julia, and he kept this post till his death. Meanwhile, he composed with uncontrollable fertility. In all, 93 masses, 486 antiphons, offertories, motets, and psalms, and a great number of madrigals. Some of these were on secular themes, but as Palestrina aged, he turned even this form to religious purposes. His first book of spiritual madrigals in 1581 includes some of his most beautiful chants. Personal misfortunes may have colored his music. In 1576 his son Angelo died, leaving to his care 2 beloved grandchildren, who died a few years later. Another son died about 1579, and in 1580 the death of his wife moved the composer to think of becoming a monk. However, he married again within a year. The astonishing abundance and quality of Palestrina's product raised him to the leadership of Italian, if not of all European music. His setting of the Song of Solomon to 29 motets in 1584, his Lamentations of Jeremiah of 1588, his Stabat Mater and Magnificat of 1590, confirmed his reputation and his persisting power. In 1592 his Italian competitors joined in presenting him with a collection of Vesper Psalms, honoring him as the common father of all musicians. On January 1st, 1594, he dedicated to the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany a second book of spiritual madrigals, combining again religious devotion with musical mastery. A month later he died in the 69th year of his age. His tomb bore under his name the title he had earned, Musicae Princeps, Prince of Music. We must not expect to appreciate Palestrina today unless, ourselves in a religious mood, we hear his music in its proper setting as part of some solemn ritual. And even there its technical aspects may leave us more marveling than moved. In a literal sense, the proper setting can never return, for it was music of the Catholic Reformation, the somber tone of a stern reaction against the sensuous joyousness of the pagan Renaissance. It was Michelangelo surviving Raphael, Paul IV replacing Leo X, Loyola displacing Bembo, Calvin succeeding Luther. Our current preferences are a transient and fallible norm, and an individual's taste, especially if he be lacking in technical competence, in mysticism, and a sense of sin, is a narrow base on which to rest a standard of judgment in music or theology. But we can all agree that Palestrina carried to its completion the religious polyphony of his day. Like most high artists, he stood at the crest of a line of development in feeling and technique. He received a tradition and completed it. He accepted discipline, and through it gave structure to his music, an architectonic stability against the winds of change. Who knows but some not very distant age, tiring of orchestral sonorities and operatic romances, may find again in such music as Palestrina's a depth of feeling, a profound and placid flow of harmony, better fitted to express the soul of man cleansed of pride in reason and power, and standing again humble and fearful before the engulfing infinite. Chapter 35. Literature in the Age of Rabelais, 1517 to 1564. 1. Of making books. After Gutenberg, the impulse to self-display took an added form, the itch to be in print. It was a costly urge, for the only copyright then known was the exclusive privilege given by civil or ecclesiastical authorities to print a specified book. Such a grant was exceptional, and without it, rival publishers, even in the same country, might pirate a work at will. If a book sold well, the publisher would usually give the author an honorarium, but almost the only publications profitable enough to earn such a fee were popular romances, tales of magic or marvels, and controversial pamphlets which had to be abusive to sell. Works of scholarship were lucky to pay their cost. Publishers encouraged authors to dedicate such productions to state or church dignitaries, or affluent magnates or lords, in the hope of a gift for the laud. Printing and publishing were generally united in the same firm, and the man or family that engaged in them was a vital factor in his town and times. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.